believe that everyone in this room would agree that we have a responsibility to make sure that we leave our children a healthy world full of opportunity. But we all know, I think, that our environment is changing, and we pretty much know why. When we burn fossil fuels to drive our cars or to generate electricity in our power plants, we emit global warming emissions, such as carbon dioxide or CO2, that rise up into the atmosphere, sort of diffuse around the planet and trap heat, and keep trapping heat. And that's what I think a lot of people don't recognize, is that CO2, much of the CO2 that's emitted lasts in the atmosphere for 100 years or more. So what that literally means is that the emissions we are putting up there today will be trapping heat and setting our children's climate future.
In 2005, Pennsylvania emitted 317 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. That's roughly equal to 1% of the worldwide emissions of greenhouse gases. If you consider Pennsylvania as a standalone, we'd be among the top 25 emitting nations in the world. And we're behind California and Texas in that regard. A couple of key areas that are going to be significant for Pennsylvania in terms of the opportunities and challenges presented by the analysis done under Act 70. There are a few areas where we actually exceed the national average in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and those are notably in the electric production sector and the fossil fuel industry. Because we are a fossil fuel rich state, coal state, a large percentage of our emissions come from electric production. About 10% of our carbon greenhouse gas footprint is actually from energy that's made here but exported out of our state. We are a net exporter of electricity.
So this graphic shows heat index. We've divided Pennsylvania into eastern and western, so let's take eastern for a minute. We're using the same color scheme on the graph. The red means the higher emission scenario, the gold means the lower. So if emissions continue unabated by the end of, by the end of the century, Philadelphia is going to feel more like Jacksonville by the end of the century. On the other hand, if we get serious about reducing our emissions, we can limit the damage to about Virginia. So Virginia may still feel too hot, but it seems to me it's a lot better than Florida. Now again, we're not talking about how this might feel in January, we're talking about how this is going to feel in July. In Pittsburgh, for the western part of the state over here, by the end of the century, with no emissions reductions, we're looking at western Pennsylvania feeling more like Alabama. Again, this is how it will feel to those of us who live in these places. And Pennsylvania alone, as Peck's analysis has shown, releases 1% of the global heat trapping emissions from one state, from your state. So making progress here in Pennsylvania is really an important contribution to this national and global problem. Now the good news, of course, is like John pointed out, Peck's roadmap and other analyses are very clear that there are many, many things that we can do starting right now to reduce our emissions in the Northeast, in Pennsylvania. You can make changes in electric power generation, in buildings, transportation, industry, and in forests and agricultural settings. So a lot of opportunities, we just need to take hold of them.
Basically, carbon sequestration is the process or the action of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere where it's causing us problems. And you can do that in a number of ways. Good old-fashioned photosynthesis. Soils will store carbon dioxide. Or you can do it through technology, carbon capture and storage technology, which I'm going to talk about a little bit this morning. Once you extract it from the atmosphere, you've got to store it someplace or sequester it in what are called carbon sinks. What are carbon sinks? There are basically two kinds. There's terrestrial carbon sinks and geological carbon sinks. Terrestrial, think plants, grasses, trees, and soils. Third-grade photosynthesis, the process of green plants taking in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, etc. There's also geologic sinks, basically underground geologic formations, unminable coal seams, that essentially present themselves now in a carbon-constrained world as new natural resources, and that's hence the quotes around that understand the capability and potential of these underground resources to store carbon in 96. In fact, last year MIT came out with a study called The Future of Coal that said that this whole idea of carbon capture and storage is the critical enabling technology that will allow the globe to lower carbon dioxide emissions and still meet our energy needs, given the ubiquity of coal. They did point out that this technology needs to be applied to power plants and demonstrated at a power plant scale, because that's not happened yet. So given its geologic resources, potentially has over 100 years of underground storage capacity at present emission rates. There are various target formations that are listed there, but we have a very, very significant geologic storage resource in Pennsylvania that really places us, competitively speaking, at a big advantage to a lot of other states. We also looked at what is the potential to capture fugitive methane in the northeast part of the state. Methane is 21 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of methane leaking out of mines in the anthracite region. So what is the potential to capture that? Is there sufficient economic scale to make a resource exploitation possible? So we're looking at the possibility of doing a project along those lines. And now we turn to the other portion of sequestration, the terrestrial side. What is the role of Pennsylvania's 17 million acres of forest land? That's 2.1 million acres under DCNR's stewardship of the state forests, and the 15 million acres of privately owned forest land. Now, top level, and these numbers come out of PEC's roadmap. All of the forest land in Pennsylvania currently offsets about 5% of the state's emissions, and that's on a consumption basis. And I won't bore you with the distinction between consumption and generation. But rule of thumb, all of the forest land in the Commonwealth currently offsets about 5% of the state's emissions. And that's significant. When you're looking at the magnitude of the challenge of emissions reductions, 5% is a big number. So the question really becomes, how do you preserve that capacity? How do you grow that capacity? And you do that basically in 4 ways. You plant a lot of trees. You protect forests, you restore forests, you manage forests to enhance its ability to uptake carbon. You put more products into wood. This, believe it or not, is carbon sequestration. If you make stuff out of wood, you are storing this for as long as this piece of furniture remains intact. So
a 5% demand reduction during the 100 most expensive hours would save the ratepayers about $1.9 million annually. And it also is the power that is the least efficient, because when the grid is demanding power, you bring on your more efficient plants first, and the last plants to come on are your least efficient plants, most expensive plants. So you would reduce, by reducing demand, you reduce not only the cost of that electricity, but you would also reduce the environmental impact of that electricity. And anecdotally, we've seen a 5% reduction in demand on oil had resulted in a huge reduction in the price of oil. We went from 147, now I wouldn't say that it's completely the 93 that we're seeing today. I don't think it's completely from the demand side. But a 5% reduction in oil reduced the demand, reduced the price of oil from 140 to 110, 100. So demand, I think demand responses work.
Ultimately, this is a test of people in this democracy, and it's a test of their government. Are we willing to really put aside some of the sacred, I'll call them cows, of various belief systems, sacred cows of various interest groups, in order to arrive at a pragmatic, workable way forward for this state? If we succeed in doing that, we have a great new story, great new future for this state that we can hand to our children and grandchildren with a lot of pride. Because this task is It's not easy, it is difficult, but it is not mission impossible.